So what was it that the communists sought to accomplish by establishing socialism? Well, in the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels famously said that the essence of communism is the abolition of private property. Why did they want to abolish private property? For several reasons. One is that by abolishing it, they hoped that property could be taken away from the small class of capitalists and wealthy people who controlled it and used in the interest of the entire people. Therefore, this would enable the government to greatly reduce poverty by redistributing wealth to the poorer elements of society. It also would reduce what Marx called the exploitation of the workers, and in his view, this existed not just if the worker was poor, but it existed any time you work for a private employer of some sort, in that if you're working for an employer, even if you're making a lot of money, still the employer is taking a part of the proceeds of your labor. So in Marx's viewpoint, you're being exploited because you're not getting the full proceeds of what your labor is producing. Some of it is being taken away by the capitalists. So notice on this theory, even if you're, even if you make a huge amount of money, you say you're one of the professional baseball players that played in a game last night, you're still being exploited because the owners of the franchise are taking some proportion of the profit that is created by your labor. And Marx thought that was unjust and it should be eliminated. Ultimately, Marx and other communists predicted that when socialism was established, over time it would produce massive prosperity. Society would be far better off in economic terms than it would be under capitalism, therefore that there would be enormous economic gains to be had by making production function in such a way that it produced goods for the benefit of the people rather than for the benefit of a small class of communists. But in addition to creating additional prosperity, communists also hope to create what they call the new socialist man or a new socialist woman. And socialist man, unlike man in capitalist society, would not be selfish. He or she would not be motivated by greed for themselves. Rather, they would be motivated to work hard for the benefit of the entire society, to create economic, technological, and scientific advances, so a new and better kind of human being would gradually emerge. This is a Soviet representation of what the new socialist man and woman would ultimately look like. They would also be physically healthier. They wouldn't be fat slobs or whatnot. They would look after themselves better than people in capitalist society would. So you can see these two people look very healthy. So the idea was both to create a better and more prosperous society, to eliminate exploitation, to create a new and better kind of human being, and ultimately, after some period under socialism, true communism could be established. And Marx actually predicted that when this happened, the state would wither away. In the socialist period, the state would have to control the entire economy, but Marx said eventually that wouldn't be necessary because eventually the new socialist type of culture and society would emerge and people wouldn't need the compulsion of the state to do the work that needed to be done. They wouldn't need it to avoid committing crimes and so forth. So over time, the state would wither away. It's somewhat ironic given that actual socialism is associated with massive state power, and Marx did expect that and hoped that would happen during the initial transition to socialism especially, but eventually he hoped that the state would wither away, though neither he nor other communists, at least in the early period, were at all clear about exactly how and when this would happen. So what were the actual results of communism in the Soviet Union and elsewhere? Sadly, the actual results bore very little relationship to this utopian agenda that the communists hoped to achieve. One huge result was mass murder on an epic scale. Communist regimes over the last century have killed more people than any other kind of regime combined, or in all other kinds of regimes combined. Here we have the two biggest communist mass murderers with their estimated death tolls, but similar mass murders happen in pretty much every country that had a communist government for any length of time. And there are several mechanisms by which the mass murder occurred. The biggest killer was the collectivization of agriculture. These are people who starved to death after the collectivization of agriculture in the Soviet Union. Probably between 6 and 11 million people died in this way in the Soviet Union. In China, the Great Leap Forward established collectivization in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And here the death toll was even greater, estimated to be over 40 million. This is probably the single biggest episode of mass murder in the entire history of the world. The Soviet collectivization is probably in second place on that list. Both of these, in terms of their death tolls, were probably significantly larger than even the Holocaust. I'm not saying this proves they were worse than the Holocaust. You don't necessarily want to judge these things by numbers alone, but at least they're very much in the same ballpark. And in the case of the Chinese collectivization, it's actually a ballpark all to itself, in that this 40 million death toll is bigger than the Holocaust plus Stalin's mass murders combined. So it's just on an epic scale. What happened with the collectivization of agriculture is that when the government took away the land and livestock for the peasants and turned it into government property, incentive to produce plummeted. In addition, the government either killed or deported many of the independent peasants. They viewed them as a threat to the new communist order, so many of these people were killed, or often they were deported to places where they were living in horrific conditions, so people died that way. So incentives to produce were nearly wiped out, and in addition, many of the most productive peasants and farm workers were killed or deported or otherwise repressed. So it's often not thought of this way, but the collectivization of agriculture was by far the biggest source of mass murder under communism. But it was far from the only one. Perhaps the second most significant was the establishment of slave labor camps, which also existed first in the Soviet Union with the Gulag system, but later in most other communist countries with various kinds of slave labor camps. China had, still to some extent, had the so-called Laogai system. There are also camps like this in North Korea, in Cuba, and elsewhere. And these accounted for an additional, probably all told, tens of millions of people dying, and many others who were fortunate enough to survive, but they lost years of their lives to this sort of institution. And in these camps were used to incarcerate people who were seen as potential opponents of the regime, but also even people who weren't necessarily opponents in any meaningful sense, but they violated some of the myriad regulations that socialist states adopted, including suppressing what would traditionally be ordinary economic activity, or in some cases belonging to the wrong economic or social class, and the like. Finally, it's worth noting that the communist regimes also killed quite a few people in just conventional mass murders, ordinary executions. This is a picture of the aftermath of one such mass execution in Cambodia in 1979, but of course there were many others. The death toll for these kinds of executions was actually smaller than either the collectivization of agriculture or the slave labor camps, but it was actually on quite a massive scale. It just pales in comparison to these other modes of killing, because it turns out that it's more difficult and less efficient to kill people by lining them up and shooting them than to starve them to death or work them to death and the like. The Nazis actually learned the same lesson during the Holocaust, which is why they ended up setting up concentration camps as opposed to their initial efforts of executing Jews by lining people up and shooting them. But these mass executions still were on a large scale. Some of the people executed were political opponents of the regime, including people who even belonged to other socialist movements other than the ruling party. Others were people who were just in the wrong place in the wrong time or committed other kinds of often trivial offenses. So it's only in comparison to the other larger crimes of communism that these mass executions seem relatively modest by comparison. Obviously, the death toll, while enormous and horrific, it was not by itself the full extent of communist oppression. There was also a lot of quote-unquote lesser forms of oppression that were inflicted on those people who were not executed, the suppression of freedom of speech and religion, the suppression of a lot of ordinary economic activity, the expropriation of most property rights, not just those of the wealthy, but also those of the middle class and even sometimes the poor. I mentioned already the collectivization of agriculture, which took away land even from peasants who had people who were of quite modest means. So these other forms of oppression, while not quite as significant or at least not quite as shocking as the death toll, were also very important and also on an enormous scale, and particularly some of the most established and longest lasting communist regimes. North Korea is probably the worst example. They had these forms of oppression and control probably to a greater extent than any other society in human history. North Korea is the society that probably most closely approximates George Orwell's book 1984 and what he describes there, and the attempt to control virtually every aspect of society, to fill every aspect of life with government propaganda, and so on. So the question arises, why did all of this happen? Why was it that this dream of prosperity and happiness and freedom turned into this terrible nightmare? And I think obviously quite a lot of different factors played into it, but a big one, perhaps the single biggest, was the problem of incentives. In order to make a socialist system function, there had to be an enormous concentration of power. Government planners had to have control of all or nearly all economic activity in the society, and obviously this creates enormous possibilities of abuse. The people who wield such power, it's unlikely that they'll be able to restrain themselves for very long. In addition, in order to make the system work, or even in order to even try to make it work, you need to have very coercive and oppressive methods. You needed somehow to force people to do the work that the government wanted them to do, and not just a few people, but nearly all of the workers in the society. And if you don't have market incentives through paying competition and the like, coercion often was necessary, and this is why all socialist societies have made extensive use of forced labor of various kinds. And of course, in order to make this work, you need to punish people who resist. You need to punish people who don't go with the program, don't want to do the work that they're assigned to do. And also you need to prevent resistance movements from arising, such as opposing political parties. If one of these parties is able to take power, then that might really throw a wrench into the works of the government's plan, and that you can't have that. Indeed, over time, the communists decided that you can't even risk the possibility of having other kinds of socialist opposition parties that were independent of the official party line. Although these people were socialists, they might put in place a plan that differs from the existing plan. That would throw a wrench into the works. It would cause instability and problems. You couldn't have that. So actually, even pretty early on in the history of the Soviet Union, the communist government banned not just so-called bourgeois or capitalist parties, but even other socialist parties, including the Socialist Revolutionary Party, which was the most popular political party of pre-revolutionary Russia. This party was banned by the Soviet government, and its members either repressed or in some cases they ended up in exile. In addition, many people have pointed out, the phrase comes from F.A. Hayek, the great economist: the worst people come out on top in these kinds of regimes. Now, often what is meant by that is that people say, well, the problem is that once this kind of regime is established and bureaucrats or government officials have enormous power, then these sorts of jobs will attract personalities who are just selfish and greedy and want to seize stuff for themselves. In Russia, the term for this is the Naumann Clutch, the party bureaucrats. I know there are other similar terms in other communist societies, so the fear is, well, these people who don't really believe in the ideals of communism will come to power and they'll just be in it for themselves. I think there's something to this, but it's striking that many of the worst atrocities of communist regimes happen not when the regime had been in place for a long time and these careerists were able to come into power. They actually came early on in the history of the regime when more idealistic people were in power. a person like Lenin or Mao Zedong or Stalin, it's very hard to argue that these people were pure careerists. They were communists long before most people thought there was any real chance that the Communist Party could come to power in their countries. And they were clearly true believers in their ideology. Indeed, they held these views even under the previous government, which often sometimes even tried to repress communists. So a large portion of the atrocities that were committed by communists, probably by far the largest proportion, was not committed by careerists who were just trying to stay in power or protect their perks. It was committed by true believers who really thought that this was necessary to make the system work. If Lenin, Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, and other communist rulers only killed those people that they needed to kill to get into power and stay there, instead of killing tens of millions of people, it might have been, quote, only hundreds of thousands. So in many respects, the idealists actually did much more harm than pure careerists. Later in the history of the Soviet Union, when more careerist-oriented politicians were in power, like Leonid Brezhnev, for example, these were bad people. They didn't kill nearly as many people as Lenin or Stalin. When the more careerist-oriented Deng Xiaoping came to power in China in 1978, he actually established market-oriented economic reforms that greatly improved the lives of the people. He wasn't as much of a true believer in the ideology as Mao Zedong was, and the nation was actually better for it. He still was a bad person. He committed the Tiananmen Square massacre, for instance, but that really was about his staying in power. And it killed a few thousand people rather than many millions of people. But there is this tendency in these regimes for bad people to come into power, the true believers in the ideology who are willing to kill millions of people to make it happen, and also over time later the sort of the pure careerists who are greedy and self-interested. Therefore, the problem of incentives is severe and applies not just to the rulers, but to the population as a whole, where because of the absence of market incentives, there's very little incentive to produce goods that consumers actually want or to work hard. Such things, for the most part, were not rewarded. As the saying from Russia goes, we pretend to work and they pretend to pay. That is, you're not paid based on your actual productivity, and if that's the case, why bother to work hard? In addition to the problem of incentives, there's also the problem of knowledge, particularly pointed out by the great economist F.A. Hayek, who I mentioned, and also Ludwig von Mises. And Mises and Hayek and other scholars pointed out that in order for a socialist economy to work, even if the planners are well-intentioned, all they care about is the welfare of society, they need a great deal of information. They need to know what kinds of goods to produce, how to produce them, how to get them to those who need them, and so forth. And that kind of knowledge is simply impossible for the government to have on a large scale. Especially in a large, complicated society with millions of people, many different preferences, many different kinds of goods. Now, you might say to yourself, what we need is to put in power scientific experts to do the planning. Yes, maybe just conventional careerist politicians, they don't have this kind of knowledge, but experts certainly perhaps do. So, for example, you can have experts in public health run the healthcare system. You can have experts in food run food production, and so on and so forth. And I think expert knowledge is of great value. Experts can know a lot of things, but they also have severe limitations on their knowledge. For example, an expert in healthcare very likely knows much better than you or I know how much damage you might cause to your health if you drink a lot or if you smoke or if you're a couch potato or whatnot. They can tell you a lot about that. What they can't tell you and what they can't know is how much do you enjoy drinking or smoking or watching your favorite TV shows in preference to exercising and so forth. Now, in my case, I actually don't smoke, and unlike most of my fellow Russians, I don't even like to drink that much. I can go a month without taking a drink and not know the difference. But obviously, many of my fellow Russians, and even more, and also people even of some other nationalities, they feel very differently, and there's a diversity of preferences on this, such that different people have different trade-offs. and therefore, even if the government planners are scientific experts, they have a lot of scientific knowledge, what they can't know is your particular preferences, the trade-offs in your mind between the benefits of smoking and drinking or watching TV on the one hand and the costs on the other. Very few people live optimally healthy lifestyles in such that they maximize their health. They usually trade it off for other values in some respects. And the same thing applies to every other kind of decision we make. Do you want to have a bigger house, or would you rather spend your money on better and nicer furniture? Do you want to have a more expensive car, or do you want to take more vacations abroad? And there's dozens or thousands of such trade-offs that any one person makes in their life, much less in an entire economy. And this is what Hayek calls local knowledge, the knowledge of different people's own preferences and trade-offs. And it's something even the greatest scientists and planners cannot really know about the entire society. Sometimes it's hard to even know it about yourself. It's hard to say, what will my preferences be 10 or 20 years from now, much less to predict such things for people whom I don't know. And this is also why, even with better technology or better science, socialist planners are simply incapable of acquiring the knowledge that they would need to plan the economy in this way. On the other hand, the market system does have a good mechanism for utilizing this knowledge. It's called the price system. That when I decide whether I'm going to buy a PowerPoint clicker like this, it has a price. That price carries with it information about the demand that other people have for either the clicker itself or the goods that go into it, the plastic, the metal, and so forth. Therefore, the price system conveys this valuable information, and it conveys it in a very succinct form. So I don't need to know that there's a particular person in California or in India who also needs a clicker. All I need to know is that the price of the clicker is $15 or whatever it is, and that conveys information to me about what the alternative uses of it are, and also conveys information to the suppliers of or the producers of clickers, and so forth. And crucial to the price system are property rights. Obviously, people have an incentive to respond to these price signals because they have property in the goods that can be used to produce the various products, and so have an incentive to respond to the signals. And also, when I buy something like this, I know that I will be able to retain control over it, as opposed to in a system of in a socialist system where the government controls the property rights, and therefore neither the producers nor the consumers have the assurance that they will actually own the things that they produce and consume, and so forth. The price system obviously isn't perfect. There are various market failures that economists have posited exist there. We can talk about some of that in questions, but at least in this respect, it's far superior to socialism. Now, some people nonetheless have said that there are a range of other possible explanations for the failures of socialism, which, if they're correct, they suggest that maybe socialism could work if it was set up in a different way. I think the most commonly cited of these is lack of democracy. That every communist regime that we've seen has been undemocratic. It's been an authoritarian one-party state. So to say if the system was democratic, it would work much better. So for instance, if the government engaged in mass murders or famines or other atrocities, then the voters would see that. They would punish those politicians at the polls, and they would elect people who would do better. Similarly, if the government's economic planning was producing goods that were of low quality or different from the ones that people actually wanted, then the voters could act accordingly and elect a new party into power that would produce better consumer goods that would more effectively meet people's demands. I think there's two serious problems with the democracy or the lack of democracy explanation for the failure of socialism. One is that I think it's not actually an accident that these governments were undemocratic. In order for the system to work, the government had to have control of all or nearly all of the economy. If the incumbent government has control of all or most of the resources in society, it's very difficult for an opposition party to form and maintain itself because they need resources, they need access to media, they need to be able to organize, they need property to use for the organization and the like. And if all of those assets, or most of them, are controlled by the government, it's very difficult for an opposition party to maintain itself, and the government government, of course, has a strong incentive to use its power to suppress the opposition. But let's set that aside for a moment and say, well, somehow there is a democratic socialist system, and one where, for whatever reason, opposition parties can function and are not simply suppressed. Even there, I think there's reason for great skepticism. In particular, there's no reason to believe that a democratic socialist system, even if it stayed democratic, could solve the problem of knowledge. They would still have the problem of trying to figure out what people's preferences are, how they make trade-offs between different goods, and they would face the same sorts of difficulties in figuring that out as government planners in the more authoritarian socialist system would do. Moreover, the bigger and more complicated the government is, the more issues it deals with, the worse the problem of voter ignorance, a subject about which I've written a book, which I think you've passed out flyers for it. Even in the status quo, data show that the voters know very little about what's going on and about very basic government policies. Consider what happened in the last election and the way voter ignorance was exploited there. And with an even bigger and more complicated government, this would make it even harder for the voters to effectively monitor what the government is doing. It would be easy for politicians to sell snake oil to the voters to argue that policies that are actually harmful will be beneficial. And so the problem of voter ignorance, which already is a very serious problem even in existing democratic societies, would be even more severe with a democratic socialist system, assuming that such a system could maintain itself over time. Another factor which is often blamed for the failures of communism in various societies is culture. It is often said the problem wasn't socialism, it was Russian culture, or it was Chinese culture, or perhaps Cuban culture or other culture. It is indeed true that Russia had a history of authoritarianism and oppression long before the communists took over. The Tsarist regime was quite oppressive. You might be able to say the same thing about China as well. It also had a series of oppressive governments. And it's also true that if you look at other places where the communist governments took power, in general, they were mostly, with few exceptions, they were mostly also places which had a history of authoritarianism and oppression. So it could be argued that the problem here is that these governments came to power in societies with authoritarian political cultures. If they had come to power in a society with more of a tradition of liberal democracy, maybe you would have had better results. And indeed, Karl Marx expected that the first socialist society would not be a place like Russia. He thought that Russia was backward and oppressive. He thought it would actually be in a place like Germany or France or the United States or the UK, countries with more of a tradition of liberalism and democracy. I think it's certainly true that culture has an impact on politics. However, it is very difficult to argue that the failures of communism were largely due to culture because they happen in much the same way in so many different societies. China, Russia, Cuba, Korea, now Venezuela, we're seeing it played out. These are societies with very different cultures and histories, yet the results of communism are very similar. When I meet people who are refugees from Cuba or from communist China or from Korea, when they tell me about their experience, it's instantly recognizable to me from things that I know from my own family's history in Russia, even though Russia is a different society. And if you look at even a country like Cuba, which I know many of you are familiar with, you see very similar results. For example, in Cuba, the government killed roughly 80 or 100,000 people, much smaller number than in Russia, but that number actually is very large if you consider that the population of Cuba in 1960 was only about 6 million. So if you multiply that out over a larger society, it's a scale of killing only modestly smaller than in Russia, and it would of course have been larger if not for the fact that Cuba, as you know, is near Miami, so many of those who might have been killed were able to escape. Russians, Chinese, North Koreans, and others did not have that kind of opportunity, so the proportional death tolls were larger. In addition, even in these countries like Russia and China, where you could say there was a lot of authoritarianism and oppression before, still it's striking that the post-revolutionary society was more oppressive and more authoritarian than previously. Late Tsarist Russia actually had a good deal of liberalization. There were opposition political parties that operated openly, including even some socialist parties. Obviously, under the communists, the scale of mass murder was much larger, and the repression of opposition political forces and of religion and other aspects of society was much greater than under the czars. So even if you want to blame, in some ways, the legacy of czarism for what happened in Russia, you still have to explain why is it was so much worse than it was under the czars. That as bad as they were, Lenin called the czarist regime the prison house of nations. The Soviet Union was also a prison house of nations, only a much worse one than the one that had existed before. Another explanation is often given is that maybe the problem was bad individual leaders. So these bad people who were authoritarian, oppressive, or cruel, even psychopathic in some cases, came to power. With a better class of leader, maybe things would have been different. So for instance, some people say it was very unfortunate that Joseph Stalin won out in the struggle for power in the Soviet Union after Lenin died in 1924, because Stalin was a really ruthless and cruel person. Maybe things would have gone better if his rival Leon Trotsky had won. And similarly, maybe things would have gone better in China if the leader of the communist regime, the first leader, was not Mao Zedong, but a nicer person, one who wasn't as cruel as he was. I think it's very hard to argue that this is the true explanation for what happened because, again, you see similar results across a wide range of communist countries which had different types of personalities as leaders. So it seems like one of two things is likely to be true. Either these regimes have a tendency to bring bad people to power, or the structure of the regime actually matters more than the personality of the leader, and the structure is what causes all the terrible results. I think actually both of these things are true to some extent for reasons that I mentioned earlier. Finally, we have the Orthodox Marxist explanation for what happened. It is often forgotten, but Orthodox Marxists, including Marx himself, believed that the socialist revolution could only happen in the most advanced nations, those that had already gone through a long period of capitalist development and had a large industrial working class. Marx believed that such a thing could never happen in a place like Russia or China because those places were backward and most of the population consisted of peasants. Marx had a very low opinion of peasants. He thought they were stupid and backward and ignorant, and they certainly didn't have revolutionary class consciousness like industrial workers could have. So when Lenin launched his coup in 1917, a number of Orthodox Marxists, including the Mensheviks in Russia, the opponents of the Bolsheviks within the Russian Social Democratic Party, they said, you're doing this too soon. Russia isn't ready for a socialist revolution. You have to wait until there's a period of capitalist development and there's a large industrial working class. And so if you buy this argument, then maybe the problem was that the communists came to power in the wrong places. They came to power in these places that were too backward and primitive. And so, of course, you had bad results. If it had happened as Marx had expected it to happen in France, in Germany, in the United States, or in England, maybe things would have come to a better result. And obviously, this is the original Menshevik critique of the Bolsheviks, and it's carried on to this day. It's worth noting that, as some of you perhaps know, the word Bolshevik comes from the Russian word for majority, whereas Menshevik comes from the word for minority. But in actual fact, it was actually the Mensheviks who were in the majority within the Social Democratic Party. The Bolsheviks were able to seize the name Bolshevik for themselves because what happened is that during a speech at a party conference in 1903, Lenin was being a real jerk, as he often was, since many of his opponents walked out in protest of his bad behavior. And at that moment, Lenin's faction seized the opportunity to take a vote, and they were in the majority in that vote because their opponents had walked out, many of them. And so they said, now we're the Bolsheviks, so the name was able to stick. But in actuality, they were the minority, not the majority. Nonetheless, although the Mensheviks may have been the true majority, I highly doubt that they were right in their explanation of why the bad results in Russia and elsewhere occurred. One issue is that when communism was later established in a few more advanced societies like Czechoslovakia and East Germany, you still got the same results. And more generally, it's difficult to see how establishing socialism in a more advanced society would actually solve either the problem of incentives or the problem of knowledge. It seems like these problems would both still be there. They might even be even worse in an economy that's more complex and sophisticated. And here is actually a dramatic example of why the cultural explanation is probably wrong, in that if you look here, you have the famous picture of North and South Korea at night. You can see how in North Korea it's almost completely dark because most people don't have access to electricity, whereas in South Korea, of course, it's much brighter. Obviously, these people on both sides of this border are ethnic Koreans. At least when they started out in the 1950s, they had very similar cultures, almost exactly the same, but yet strikingly different results based on the economic and political system. And a similar story can be told about East and West Germany, and China and Taiwan, and some other examples. I think while cultural values do matter, it turns out, at least in these cases, institutions matter a great deal more. So what can we learn from this experience? I think obviously remembering the history has value in and of itself. There are many millions of victims of communism still alive, and obviously many people who had parents or relatives or friends who were victims, so we should remember it if only for that reason, just as we remember the Holocaust for those kinds of reasons. But there's also practical value to remembering because there are still a few more or less unreconstructed communist regimes out there, North Korea, to some extent Cuba. So that oppression continues, albeit communists no longer rule 1/3 the population of the world as they once did. Moreover, the popularity of socialism continues to exist and may rise in various places. The case of Venezuela, a current attempt to establish a socialist regime, which is leading to terrible results, predictably so. Also, socialist-type movements have had a new growth in popularity even in the Western world. I note the rise of Jeremy Corbyn, an unreconstructed socialist, who has now become the leader of the Labour Party in Britain and almost became prime minister in the last British election. The rise of Bernie Sanders here in the United States. Sanders, Corbyn, and others like them don't want to go quite as far as Lenin or Stalin did, or at least they say they don't want to go as far, but they still do want to socialize large parts of the economy and bring it under government control. And that gets us to another important reason to remember these lessons, in that while most people in the West today and even in the developing world do not want to establish full-blown socialism, many of them, both on the right and the left, do favor government control or over very large portions of the economy. Notable examples are healthcare and education, but there are some others as well. And while the knowledge and incentive problems with government control of these large parts of the economy are not quite as severe as with government control of the entire economy, nonetheless they're pretty severe nonetheless, and you have some of these same sorts of problems. It is not my claim that any government regulation of any kind has this problem, but it is my view, and I think it's backed by a lot of evidence, that government attempts to control all or most of some large sector of an economy, particularly a complicated one like education or healthcare, does have many of these same sorts of problems. Finally, it's worth briefly noting the connection between socialism, the parallels between socialism and the other ideology, which is second only to socialism in terms of the number of people that it has killed and oppressed, and that is the ideology of nationalism. And nationalism culminating in things like Nazism and fascism, but also in many less extreme nationalist movements, has also posted an enormous bounty count in the tens of millions and led to enormous repression in many parts of the world. Nationalism and socialism are different in important respects, but they also have important parallels. One is that they both tend to favor extensive government control of the economy and society. In one case, to benefit the working class or people as a whole. In another case, to benefit members of a particular religious, ethnic, or racial group or particular nationality. They also both tend to argue that we need an enormous concentration of power in the government and have little regard for civil liberties. They also have strong authoritarian tendencies. There's even parallels in the structures that they build. Communists tend to build walls to keep their people in. Nationalists want to build walls to keep people out, as we see right now with the nationalist who's the current president of the United States. And in both cases, it's an enormous imposition on the freedom of millions of people on both sides of the wall. Now, there are obviously more and less extreme examples of nationalism, just as is also true for socialism. Nonetheless, these ideologies have a great deal in common. And to the extent I noted earlier that socialism may be seeing a bit of a resurgence, it's very obvious that nationalism is seeing a resurgence, not just in the US, but also in a number of places in Europe, Asia, and elsewhere. So it's worth noting the important parallels here. So on that not entirely optimistic note, I conclude, but I very much look forward to the rest of the discussion and your comments and questions. Thank you. Should I call on you myself?
Yeah, just go ahead.
Go ahead.
Hi. I have a question about one of the points that you mentioned, the lack of democracy. Because that point could be true in historic communist regimes. But however, recent communist governments such as Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea, they do hold elections, controlled elections under their own circumstances. So right now there's a shift towards democratic communist regimes, if you could use the term. How do you think that democracy could be, I guess my question is, do you first of all believe that democracy is being used as a tool for communist regimes today to guarantee their stability, their legitimacy? And second, if so, how could that be changed?
Yeah, so all communist regimes historically have claimed to be democratic, and virtually all of them have held elections. In most cases, those elections were basically frauds. You could vote, you had the choice of voting for the officially approved candidate or not voting for him, and even the choice of not voting for him was often an illusory choice because you would be punished if you didn't vote for him. It is true that in Venezuela, a communist, or at least a socialist government came to power by democratic means. It is also true, however, that as they've tried to consolidate their power, they have moved against opposition parties and tried to suppress them in exactly the way that I outlined. That's actually what's going on now. When they lost an election for the National Assembly, they essentially stripped that assembly of power. They harass opposition candidates and the like. So if the Maduro regime that's in power now fully gets its way, I think you will see the total or near total suppression of opposition parties, which is certainly what happened in Cuba, in the Soviet Union, in China, and other regimes. There is perhaps some people have discussed the possibility of having elections in communist regimes that are similar to the ones that are held in Iran, where you have some genuine electoral competition, but it's only between officially approved candidates who don't deviate too much from the official ideology. My view is that a full-blown socialist regime, even if it starts out democratic, will not be democratic for very long because the government has both the incentive and the opportunity and willingness to suppress opposition. But even if it could remain communist over time, it would have the problems that I mentioned, the problems of incentives and the problem of knowledge, and in addition, the problem of voter ignorance would make it very hard for the voter to monitor what is going on. But it is perhaps true that to the extent that socialist regimes can portray themselves as democratic, whether or not they actually are, that might lend them legitimacy in the eyes of international opinion, perhaps even also of domestic opinion as well. Yeah.
My question is regarding, I understand that I'm sure there's many good people that actually believe that a system like this can work, but having examples as Korea, that were like the same society, the same people who were like divided by the middle, and you have two perfect examples of the outcome of that system. Why do you think today at this age it's still so hard to talk about victims of communism, and it's not respected as victims of Holocaust, or even in many current trends, victims of capitalism even.
Yeah.
It's not as respected as all of those.
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think there's several factors that come into this. One is that there is some commonalities between communism and other ideologies of the left. So attacking communism is seen as, at least to some extent, as attacking the left in general, whether or not it actually is, and therefore there is reluctance to admit this. You see actually a similar issue with attitudes towards fascism and Nazism among right-wing nationalists. For example, notice that Donald Trump was very reluctant to condemn the neo-Nazis in Charlottesville. He said, well, good people were marching there because obviously, while not all nationalists are Nazis, most are not. Nonetheless, there is this connection between quote-unquote moderate nationalism and more extreme Nazism, and similarly, there is a connection between more moderate leftism and communism, even though there are also differences as well. In addition, obviously, many people, at least on the left, feel, well, communism isn't as bad as Nazism or fascism because the people had good intentions. I think this is a fallacious distinction, because if good intentions just means that you think you're doing good, Adolf Hitler thought he was doing good. He was a true believer in his ideology, just like Lenin or Mao were true believers in theirs, but that distinction is often made. And more generally, when people think about political issues, there's often a tendency for them to overvalue any evidence that supports their pre-existing views and devalue those against it. I read about this in my book about political ignorance. In our private lives, we have some incentive to keep these tendencies in check. If you have a completely unrealistic and wrong view of, say, your career possibilities, you will suffer in terms of the kind of job you can get. If you have a completely wrong view of how you can do in the dating and marriage market, you might miss out on opportunities and end up signaled, so you have some incentive to take a realistic view. In politics, by contrast, if your only reason to get a more accurate view of the political world is to be a better voter, that's not much of an incentive, because the chance that your vote will make a difference in an election is so extremely small. That helps explain why many people are ignorant about politics, but also explains why many people who do follow politics more closely, that includes many intellectuals, they do so more to satisfy their preferences than to sort of objectively seek the truth. So if you're a very committed left-winger, particularly a socialist, it's not ideologically comfortable to fully admit the horrors of communism, particularly when you have these other explanations available to you. Maybe the problem was lack of democracy, maybe it was the bad culture of Russia or of China, or this is less commonly held, but obviously there are still some Orthodox Marxists around who say, well, the Mensheviks were actually right, that if only Lenin had waited until Russia was more fully industrialized and so forth, things might have gone better. Yes?
So building off the last two questions and answers, turning our attention toward the leftist intelligentsia, this new socialism that they're pushing. Why has capitalism failed to make the legitimate case, the moral case that it's right? Why isn't success enough to say, hey, socialism doesn't work, communism doesn't work? Not only does it kill people, but economically it doesn't work. And yet these people, a large group of people in America and Europe still seem to cling to this idea that's legitimate and it's moral and it's right, and they don't see capitalism as any of those.
Yeah. So I think there's several factors. One is many of these people will point to some of these other alternative explanations that I mentioned, and explaining and understanding why these alternative explanations are wrong requires time and effort and knowledge. Also, someone would say, well, I don't even want to go as far as the full-blown communists of the Soviet Union. I don't want to take over the entire economy. I just want to take over certain key industries, healthcare, transportation, perhaps banking, and some others, but I'm not going to confiscate your house or your small business. Bernie Sanders actually had a speech like that in the last campaign. Socialism does not mean we're going to take away your house or your car. You can be secure on that. Also, I think there are other factors as well, and that is that the way that markets work and the way that they satisfy people's demands is sort of counterintuitive, that you have a way of meeting demand even though there's no one person who says, or no one government agency or planner who says we're going to make these trade-offs. It's more intuitive to say we should have a group of experts who really know what they're doing and they'll make the trade-offs. Obviously, there's also the factor that in a capitalist system, there's going to be a class of very wealthy people, and it's easy, sometimes at least, to rile up people against them. That exists in some ways under socialism, too. You have the class of powerful government officials who are also very wealthy, but by the time that emerges, obviously, it's very difficult to organize effective opposition. I think it's a combination of that it's intuitive and appealing to think we should be able to use government power to cure some of the social problems that we see out there, combined with the idea that even if you do think carefully about the failures of communism, it's not that hard to persuade yourself that the failure was due to something that we can avoid. It wasn't intrinsic to the system, maybe the lack of democracy, for example. Yeah.
Aren't the experts that you're talking about basically what our bureaucracy is right now?
To some extent. So I don't think any modern government can do completely without bureaucratic experts. Unless you want to completely abolish government, you're going to have some of them. But obviously, if you have too much confidence in their abilities, then you might end up in the fallacies that socialists have ended up in. If you don't have the right kinds of experts managing things, we can make these sorts of trade-offs. And while advocacy of full-blown socialism, like in the Soviet Union or China or Cuba, is relatively rare, there's a lot more people who believe that experts can plan substantial parts of the economy, healthcare, for instance, even if they don't. So ironically, it is widely agreed, including among left of center experts on public policy, that the government can't plan agriculture or steel production. That's a no-no. But they can plan healthcare production, education production, even though, frankly, there's not a good reason to believe that those areas are less complicated than steel or wheat production is. If anything, they're probably more complicated because steel is more of a fungible good. One type of steel is more similar to another than the healthcare that I need compared to what you need or somebody else, and similarly with education. Yeah.
So in the 1970s, we opened up relations with China. They implemented market reforms. Sort of a huge middle class, intensely loyal to that government came about. And now it seems that that communist government will not be out of power unless some type of world war were to displace them. And what I wonder is, when we talk about opening up relations with Cuba, if we were to do that, will that ensure that the Castro regime stays in power permanently because they'll be able to have those same economic opportunities, implement similar reforms, and then sort of just become the state capitalist system like China?
Yeah. So when a communist regime fades or disappears, it doesn't automatically follow that liberal democracy will replace it. It could be an authoritarian system, but with more market opportunities, which is what happened in China. Nonetheless, I would say that was a huge improvement. Both in terms of they're not killing millions of people anymore, they're only killing thousands of people, and the people who are alive have vastly greater opportunities. They have massively improved their standards of living. There's even somewhat greater freedom of speech in China than existed under Mao, that they're going in the wrong direction in the last couple years. So if Cuba followed the same evolution in China, that's far from ideal, but it would be an improvement over the status quo. Would sort of opening up economic relations or other relations with the U.S. help that along? This is sort of a complicated question. I know is much debated here in Miami as well as elsewhere. I don't have time to fully go into it, but I would note a couple of things. One is I think a lot depends on what kind of opening up we're talking about. If we're talking about just sort of more trade and investment in the enterprises controlled by the government, I think that will likely just enable the government to firm up its grip on power. On the other hand, trade and investment with more decentralized private entities, or allowing Americans to travel there more or less freely as they do in China, that I think would be beneficial. So my take on this, I'm not either in favor or against sanctions against Cuba categorically. I think it would be desirable to have more narrowly targeted sanctions, but at the same time allow Americans to travel freely to Cuba and to invest in private enterprises there. Now, obviously, often the devil is in the details, and I do question the ability of our government to sort of fine-tune the policy in that respect. Maybe we can't do it, but that, in a nutshell, is what I would ideally like to do, that there should be free, as much as possible, there should be free exchange and travel with ordinary people in Cuba and with such private industry as might emerge, but we should avoid providing resources to the government and its repressive apparatus. There may be not a way to completely separate the two. The government can tax private activity, but nonetheless, we should at least try to aim for something like that. But I would note that most of the opening with China really happened after the Chinese government began massive reforms, not before. The previous opening under Nixon was not so much an opening of trade and investment, but just a geopolitical alliance against the Soviet Union. It was not until Mao died and Deng Xiaoping won the resulting power struggle that some real reforms came in, and I don't think it's plausible that they came in because the U.S. was engaging in trade. Rather, those reforms enabled much more trade to occur than otherwise. Yes?
You talk about political ignorance, but I also think historical ignorance is a big problem. Part of the reason why maybe we don't put the Holocaust and communism on the same level is just people don't know in general. I know in high school we learned about the Holocaust every year. I don't think we ever learned about the Great Purge, the Cultural Revolution, any of this. So we kind of said, like, maybe the intellectuals can have these outs where they think, okay, there wasn't enough democracy, there wasn't the right culture, but just for the average person waving a communist flag at an Antifa rally, like, I don't know if they know.
Yeah, so that's true. There's, but I think historical ignorance is a subset of political ignorance more generally, at least historical ignorance about things that are relevant to politics, leaving aside other kinds of history like sports history or literary history or whatnot. And it is true that the U.S. government and other governments in the West have made a concerted effort to try to raise consciousness about the Holocaust. Maybe if they did a similar thing with respect to the crimes of communism, that would improve things, and they do it in the education system. I favor certainly including more of that material in educational curricula, but obviously incentivizing government to do the right thing with respect to education is quite difficult. So this is a problem not just with respect to the Holocaust, it's a problem with respect to even domestic events in the U.S. Consider the current controversy over Confederate monuments and the like, where this arises because a lot of people still believe, in part because of the way the public education system is, that maybe the Civil War wasn't really about slavery, and maybe Robert E. Lee and other Confederates didn't really support slavery and the like, even though the overwhelming historical record shows that they did support those things. That was what the war was about. That was what the Confederates themselves said at the time, but many people don't know that, in part because of the public education system, but in part because it's sometimes more comforting to believe other things. So I wish I had a good answer both to the specific problem of education about communism and the more general problem of accurate historical education in general, but it's a tough nut. It's a tough nut precisely because of the poor incentives of the governments that run or the government entities that run the education system. I'm just trying to call on people who haven't spoken yet. Yes, go ahead.
It's me, right?
Yeah.
This might be too personal of a question, but because the lecture was titled on the victims of communism, and for those of us who can't go back home, do you have anything you might want to share from your parents or immediate family that could help us deal with this kind of nostalgia and missing our home?
So it's an interesting question. What country are you from?
Venezuela.
Venezuela. So this goes to the issues of sort of different. Well, I said there is commonality of experiences that I see with Cubans, Venezuelans, Chinese, and others. There is a difference as well, and that is most Russian immigrants from the Soviet Union, who came mostly, at least those who came since the 1970s, my generation of Russian immigrants, there was an expectation that if you left, you would never get to go back. In 1979, when we left, nobody thought that communism would ever fall in the Soviet Union. Whereas with Cuba, with Venezuela, perhaps with some of these other examples, there was this sense that maybe Castro wouldn't be forever, or that maybe the communist regime wouldn't be forever. Right now in Venezuela, I think a lot of Venezuelan emigres and refugees think that there is a real chance that Maduro will fall. He maybe doesn't have everything his own way. And so I think it's a somewhat different mentality when you leave and you feel never going back. It's not even a real possibility, and that's your mindset versus you could go back. And that's not to say that Russian immigrants never feel nostalgia. I don't. I was only 5 years old, but obviously older people, they do have the difficulty of adjusting to a different culture. And the older you are, obviously, the harder it is. So I'm not sure I have a really good answer to that question. the sort of obvious but somewhat trite answer is that we have to make the best of the circumstances that we have. We can't fully recapture in a new society everything we might have liked about the culture of Cuba or Venezuela or Russia, but there are enormous opportunities in this country that we should take advantage of, even in the somewhat cruddy political circumstances that the country is in now. It's still much better than what is going on in Venezuela or Cuba or even post-communist Russia. So I've been back to post-communist Russia. It's interesting to see, but when I look at the lives of the people there, even before the sort of the worsening of the situation in Russia that Vladimir Putin has caused, even before I said, like, there's no way I would trade my life for theirs. And similarly, even if the best scenario happens and Cuba does become a liberal democratic society, or Venezuela does, it will take many years to undo the damage that has occurred from those regimes. It'll be a long time before Cuban or Venezuelan immigrants in this country can plausibly say, I could have as good a life back there as I do here. And it's worth thinking about that. But I do recognize there is a trade-off, particularly for older people who are used to a particular cultural way of life, and some losses cannot be completely recovered. I don't have a good advice for how to deal with that, other than to say we all have to try to make the best of the circumstances that we're in. It's easy for me to say that because for me, I didn't lose that much. I was only 5 years old. For a person that spent their entire adult life in Russia or in Cuba or in China, it's tougher, particularly for a person who does have the mindset of, I might be able to go back, as opposed to, I must stay in this new place, and that's the only life that I'm going to have. Yes?
So every time there's new government regulation, whether it be healthcare, education, or in this country specifically, gun control, all the people, like some of the more right, newscasters or anything, they start talking about socialism taking over or communism taking over as a fear tactic. How realistic do you think that is, and how would it go about? Because in Venezuela, I think it's only been 20 years since Chavez initially took power, and that's not a long time to go from...
Yeah, so I think certainly just as the left scaremongers about fascism, sometimes the right scaremongers about socialism or communism, so it's somewhat silly to say, like, if you're going to have gun background checks, that's socialism, or Obamacare was socialism, or like, indeed it tends to trivialize the concept of socialism and the real horrors of it, just as the left often trivializes fascism by saying that almost any policy they don't like is fascism, not just Trump, but even George W. Bush. I'm not a fan of George W. Bush, but he wasn't a fascist. That said, is it possible there could be a socialist takeover in the U.S. or in other advanced Western nations? I think, frankly, the jury's out on that. I think the odds are much higher against it than in a place like Venezuela, where obviously society was more backward, and therefore people were more willing to accept radical experiments to try to deal with it, and also constitutional constraints on government power were less institutionalized than they are in the U.S. Or in most Western European nations. However, I would not say, I think it's a mistake to say that such constraints are just so strong that we don't need to worry about it at all. I think recent political developments, both in the U.S. and in Europe, are very worrisome. Types of political movements on both the right and the left that we thought could not really have a chance of gaining power have in fact either gained power or at least gained a larger share of it. I've already mentioned Donald Trump and Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders, but you can also point to the current governments of Austria and Poland and elsewhere, where sort of right-wing nationalist elements are there. So I think there's a possibility not of a sudden socialist takeover or a sudden nationalist/fascist takeover, but I think there could be a gradual erosion over time of constitutional constraints on government power, and also of the sense in society that it's important to preserve those constraints and that we should be willing to sacrifice some short-term policy objectives to preserve them. So I'm not as alarmist about this as some scholars are. If you read Yascha Mounk, a professor at Harvard, who writes about this stuff, says, the situation is really awful. Trump could undermine liberal democracy in the U.S. in just the next couple of years. I think that's unlikely. And indeed, there has been more effective resistance to Trump than I would have predicted personally. But what is more possible is a gradual erosion over 5, 10, or 20 years. And certainly, while I still don't think that such erosion is the most likely scenario, I assign more of a probability to it now than I would have before the events of the last 2 or 3 years. I also wonder what will happen if there's another big economic crisis like we had with the Great Recession from 2008. And that could potentially give impetus to both socialist and nationalist elements that are very dangerous, just like, of course, the Great Depression gave impetus to both fascists and communists back in the 1930s. That sadly, when really bad things happen and there are bad events, or even something non-catastrophic but bad, like the slow growth of the last decade, often people don't react by embracing good ideas. They often embrace much worse ideas than those that got us into the crisis to begin with. And you see that to some extent with developments in both the U.S. and in Europe right now. Yes?
Is there a role for the courts to play in order to strike down maybe some of the policies? Because I took federal courts, and there's like this political question doctrine that they will just kind of stay away from this, even if it is on point with property rights. Or
so this raises a bigger discussion. It's in line actually with some of my academic work. I'm actually not, for the most part, an academic expert on communism. I am an academic expert on judicial review. To make a long story short, yes, I think there is a role for judicial review, both in constraining some kinds of government assaults on economic liberties and property rights, but also in constraining various forms and concentrations of government power that might threaten repression, obviously constraints on freedom of speech, freedom of religion and the like, and also various kinds of governmental discrimination. For example, unlike some people associated with the Federalist Society, I'm very happy that the courts, lower courts at least, have struck down Trump's travel ban. In and of itself, it might be only a policy affecting a modest number of people, but obviously if governments could engage in these kind of policies more generally, it would be very bad. But I also think it would be a mistake to rely solely on judicial review as our safeguard against these things. Judicial review, generally speaking, can only be effective if it's supported by at least some broader political forces. And if you look historically, movements for greater freedom that use judicial review, like the civil rights movement, the gay rights movement, the gun rights movement, and others, they usually relied on the active support of a more general political movement. They didn't just rely on the courts alone, rather they worked in tandem. So yes, judicial review is important, play an important role, but we can't leave all of it up to the judges. Other questions taken by people who haven't had a chance to speak yet? Okay, well, I think we're nearing, actually we're probably 15 minutes past our allotted time, but I do thank you for coming and for your excellent questions.